Good morning. Looks like I'm the only one here right now, and that's totally fine. Hopefully people will join pretty soon. If not, you guys can watch it on our YouTube channel. Today, I wanted to cover a couple different things. One is going over the quiz really quickly, and then I'm hoping that people show up because I want to have a little bit of a discussion. I'm going to be talking about what biomorphic abstraction is, and talking about this module number 3, the project that we're working on. The videos that we have for reference deal, I believe, mostly with carving wood, and most of those principles are sound and transfer pretty much directly to the foam you've been given. But I also want to talk about expectations and what to do when you're carving your foam. So I am going to do a screen share thingy jig and start going over the quiz. Let's see. Give me just a short 3 hours while I quickly figure this out. There we go. Oh, I'm hoping that you can see the quiz layout here. This is a relatively short quiz, but it's important, and it covers a lot of the stuff that we need to discuss for this module number 3. First is, what is the difference between form and shape? Even when you're 3D rendering, shape has to do with what you see in 2 different planes, usually just height and width. And then form becomes shape as it is transferred into 3-dimensionality. So shape would be a circle, form would be a sphere or a ball. Shape would be a square, form would be a cube. Now the 2 materials most often used in the subtraction process, this is right out of the book as well. And I want you to think about historically what have been the things that people have used to carve. And subtraction refers directly to carving. 2 most common things that people have carved over the years has been wood and stone. When you think about that, that seems to make an awful lot of sense, because most of the other materials that we use to carve just have not been around for all that long. When we go to question number 3, non-objective or non-representational forms do not refer to any object from our 3-dimensional world. The clue to the answer on this is non-objective and non-representational. Non-objective, the non means that it's not. And so if something doesn't refer to an object, and if it doesn't represent something, it doesn't have a reference to any object from our 3-dimensional world. So the answer to that is true. Question number 3. And number 4, monolithic forms do not retain the closed form of the original material. If we look at the textbook, monolithic, when we think about that word, we're looking at things like Stonehenge. Stonehenge is essentially monolithic, means one stone. The forms are just basically blocks carved out of stone and then moved into position. And they very much retain the closed form of the original material because there's not an awful lot done to it. The stone is essentially dressed and then used in the application for which it's needed. So the answer to that, monolithic forms do not retain the closed form of the original material. The answer to that is false on number 4. Number 5, stylized works conform to a particular historical style or stress a design characteristic. When we talk about style or stylized, what we're talking about is when the artist injects a bit of themselves into the representation of something. And that happens even if we consider it to be directly realistic. There's still a little bit of stylization going on because many times in even the realistic forms, they're idealized. And that means that instead of a one-to-one correspondence with the actual object the artist is referencing, the artist may even unconsciously tweak it a little bit to fit more their expectations of what the ideal characteristics is of that thing that's being represented. So when we talk about stylization, what we're talking about is usually going to be some of the artist's predilections, uh, referencing where they're from, the time period they're from, the area that they live in. Some of those make it into the design. I think it's pretty obvious example of this is going to be the religious use of figures or figurative art in Egyptian structures. We look at tomb paintings and things like that. You see a torso from the front, the legs and hips are from the side. Usually the face is from the side, and the eye that should be from the side is from the front as well, as a stylized depiction of the human form. We know that the Egyptians did that on purpose to stylize, because if you look at other examples of tomb paintings, within feet of those stylized forms, you'll see very realistic depictions of, for example, people in a wetlands working with, interacting with wildlife and plants. And the forms are distorted just like they would be if you saw them in real life, as opposed to the distortion that comes from the stylization. So the answer to that, stylized works conform to a particular historical style or stress a design characteristic, is true. Question number 6. To abstract something means to simplify it. When we abstract something, we find something, an element or a passage of whatever it is that we're working on that we like, and we work with it more. Or maybe we are cartooning something or concentrating on just the raw shapes. So when we abstract something, we are simplifying it. And then afterwards, if we go back and embellish it, that's one thing. But the answer to this, to abstract something means to simplify it, that answer is true. Now this one, as we work with the foam, the answer to this will become very apparent very quickly. Softness of material does not equate to ease of working. That is completely true. I don't know if you've done soap carving, but just because the material is soft does not mean that it's going to be easy to work with, and that becomes painfully apparent very quickly. The first mistake you make, you realize that it is not as easy as you were hoping. No, that disappointing. That's sad. When we go to question 8, the highest degree of representation is called superrealism. I think we could say that that is true. Another word for that is hyperrealism, where an artist will put more into a representation of something than can be seen ordinarily with the human eye. Even though, or recognized, I should say, with the human eye. At any given moment, we process anywhere from 200,000 to 4 million bits of information that comes through our senses. And with our eyes, we can distinguish over 1 million different shades of color. But our active brain, or our consciousness, we rely on the reticular activating system to weed through those millions of points of data and feed to our conscious mind only 20 to 40 bits of information at any given moment. So even though our eyes can distinguish millions of colors, our brain, or our consciousness, only deals with a few, relatively. And super or hyper realism, the artists that work in that genre really focus on exploring those things that our conscious mind really processes unless we're really focused on it. So the answer to that, the highest degree of representation, is called hyperrealism. That is true. Now, representational or figurative forms are those that relate directly to the human body. Is this true or false? Representation, that refers to anything that has a direct correspondence to objects or subjects that are in the relatable or physical world. And figurative forms, that relates to things that are either of a figurative size, which roughly is 4 to 6 feet tall, or are, again, representational. It's another word that artists and art historians use to mean representational. And this could very much refer to doorways or buildings or animals. It does not have to relate directly to the human body. So question 9, representational or figurative forms are those that relate directly to the human body. The answer to that is false. And question 10, Michelangelo's David is a good example of an idealized figure. This is absolutely true. Even though it was distorted a little bit, Michelangelo designed it so that the distortion was such that if you are a regular-sized person looking up from David's feet, what you will see appears to be an idealized human figure. In reality, I believe the head is a little bit bigger than it should be, and that's how it's that's how it's aligned. But that is designed so that the viewer, the human viewer, has a view from their perspective of an idealized human figure. Now, if we look at these, which of these is not carved from the living rock? Living rock refers to rock that is in situ or in place. So if we look at Mount Rushmore, it's carved right out of the Black Hills. We look at, this is called, letter C is Petra, seen from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and several other movies, like I believe Jason and the Argonauts was filmed in part there. But this is called the Treasury, and it is carved directly from that red sandstone that is evident in Petra. And Lashan Buddha is carved directly out of the mountainside. If we look at the moai of Easter Island, they are carved from basalt. They were moved by the people that carved them to the sites where they are, and then they were stood up. And so they are not carved from living rock. They are carved and then put into place. So go refer to that question. Which of the following is not carved from the living rock? The answer is B, moai. Now here's saying where you get a chance to read in the text and then write down some of the things that you pick out dealing with these phrases. One thing I really like about the textbook is if you skim through the chapters really quick and look for these kinds of phrases, it's relatively easy to find them. And if we look back really quick, see, this quiz is chapters 4 and 13. So look through chapters 4 and 13 really quick, and you will see static and dynamic forms, primary and secondary contours, interior and exterior forms, positive and negative forms. You'll see those as subtitles over paragraphs that discuss them. What I would like you to do is for A, for example, say a static form is something that feels stationary, and a dynamic form gives the illusion of movement or gives the suggestion of movement. So and that's it. That's all you need to write down. And do that for A, B, C, and D. And that will qualify as the answer for that. That'll be good. So basically you're just saying shortly what those pairings represent. And the pairings deal with the same issue but opposite sides. So static and dynamic both deal with movement. Static is stationary, dynamic is moving. Primary and secondary contours both deal with contours. One is the first thing that you see, and one is the thing that you see when you take a little bit more time. And that's how those are paired. Now, here's a really good one. Why is the subtraction process often a slow and painstaking one? And the additive process is when you're working with something like clay, and you just slap more on when you need it. Subtraction is when you're carving. When you're carving, you can't put it back. especially if you're working with a really soft material. You carve a little bit too much and you run the risk of breaking the whole thing, destroying it. There's nothing you can do about it other than readjust what you're doing. If you get an opportunity, I would like you to look up online any of the things that talk about the Crazy Horse Monument in South Dakota. The family that's been working on that has been working on that for essentially generations for the Native American people. And it is a carving of an idealized sculpture of Crazy Horse, who was essentially a George Washington type figure for the native peoples in that part of the world, in South Dakota and the area around there. He was a brilliant strategist, and he was working hard to liberate his people from the oppression of European settlers. And the monument is an entire mountain being carved into the form of Crazy Horse sitting on his horse. And if I understand it right, they've had to adjust a couple of times because there were fissures in the rock that knocked things out of place and destroyed portions of the statue that there's no way to get back. You can't glue the rock back into place very effectively. So I would think about that, refer to the text, and then write about it, even from your own experience. And I believe that that is the end of the quiz. Let's see. Yep, that's the end of the quiz. So I am going to turn off screen sharing really quick. There we go. And I am going to set up something else that I wanted to go through and just talk about. This is a PowerPoint discussion that I did to kind of talk about what non-objective artwork is, what abstraction is. And I want to kind of talk about just the evolution of different things that come into play. Let's see. I'm going to try to do a screen share again, and we will talk about that. All right, now hopefully you can see this. I'm going to do the start the slideshow. Now if we look at this, I've labeled this conveniently as to what it is, so hopefully everybody can see. This is a little bit stylized, but would you think that this, on the spectrum of stylized to non-objective / abstraction, do you think this is more stylized, or do you think this is more realistic? Excuse me. Just an interesting side note. Some insects, and household flies, houseflies, I think, are one of them. Some insects cannot really see or focus their eyes on anything unless there's movement. So as soon as something moves a little bit, the insect will be able to focus on it. Until that happens, they don't really see much. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I have read that, but it does fit with this. We look at this tree, and this is true of photography and anything else. The subject matter that the artist wants us to focus on generally is, in this type of thing, more realistically rendered as not. And we can see in this tree form dots of color that represent leaves. We can see stylized branches. But all in all, this is a fairly realistic depiction of a tree without being a photograph. Excuse me. We can see on the left-hand side there's some branches. And in the background, we can see that the trees, especially on the right-hand side, have faded a little bit. We can tell that they're trees just because from children, we've been trained to recognize that kind of a shape and color combination as a tree. Now on the left-hand side, around the white number 1, we can see that the background is faded almost entirely. But because of the information of the trees right next to the shoreline of the water, and on the right-hand side, we know that those are trees just because of our training. Then we can also surmise, and we don't even think about surmising it, that on or in that area in the upper left-hand corner, we assume that there are further trees in the background. Because we know how water reacts, we don't always really think about it, but we know it's reflective. Then we also see that the background towards the base of this orange tree, we surmise that is a lake of some sort or a pond it's sitting in front of. And we recognize that there's some ripples on the bottom on the right, and the reflections towards the shoreline, towards the back of this body of water. We can see that, or we surmise from all these bits of information, that this is a tree. But I would say that this is on a relatively realistic end of the quote-unquote tree spectrum. If you look at this, this is from the Hudson River School of Painting. I really love this school of painting. This was something that was very popular in the 19th century, and it is essentially through a non-confrontational artist lens. It is a commentary on the natural landscape. Sometimes the beauty of the natural landscape, sometimes the harsh reality of the natural landscape, and sometimes the terror, the horror vacui that some people may experience when they see something without any human habitation. Now, we do see evidence of human habitation in this. We see that, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but we see some livestock. If you look towards the bottom center of the screen, a little bit to the left-hand side, we see some livestock there. Right to the livestock, almost in the center of that bottom part of the screen, we see this figure that has a brown splotch on the bottom and a red splotch at top. Maybe that's a human being. To the right, a little bit, still towards the bottom of the screen, as we go towards this right-hand body of water, we see what we can surmise might be a boat, and maybe a human figure pulling the boat from the water. But those figures that signify human habitation are rather difficult to make out. They're tiny, they're not in focus. We know that they're there because they're blotches of color that don't fit in with the rest of the environment. And if we go over to the left-hand side of the image, if we look about a quarter of the way in from the left-hand side, almost right in the center, top to bottom of the image. So we're looking just a little bit to the right of this tall tree that goes from the bottom left of the image all the way up to the top left of the image. We see what look like blocks, children's blocks. And we can surmise, because of the two humans that we see, because of the domestic animals we see, the cows, that these are most likely structures, living structures. But they're very specifically placed, and they're very out of focus. We look at this and see that on the left-hand side, these trees are beautifully rendered, very realistic. The center towards the bottom, there's those trees that are surrounding that human being and the cows. Those trees are beautifully rendered. See this little bush on the foreground and the right? That's really beautifully rendered. So there's an awful lot of realism going on. But I say that this is the argument could be made that this is a political statement as well, because we look at how strong and wild and realistically rendered, or not necessarily realistically, but stylistically or idealistically rendered, these natural elements are. And then the people are put in almost as an afterthought. And even though we have this beautiful foreground going on with these gorgeous trees and beautiful rocks, we see that dry spot of the pathway. And an argument could be made that the artist is showing us how beautiful nature is, and that humans are either an incidental afterthought, or they could represent some sort of chipping away at that natural strength and beauty. But as far as the spectrum of realism to abstraction goes, I think we can make the case that the artist here is using realistic or idealized realism to kind of emphasize the beauty of nature. And using abstraction, just as the same way that a camera focus helps us, or I'm sorry, depth of field in a photography helps us focus our attention, maybe the artist is using that in a similar way, and that the abstraction of the landscape is to help us to accept the reality of the scene, because it's very rare that when we look at a landscape scene, all elements are in equal um, clarity. So we do have some elements of clarity to look at, but also this feels as if it is rolling away from us in a rather realistic way. We see the atmospheric perspective turning the mountains and the trees blue as they get farther away. The clouds are kind of losing focus because the farther away they get, and the trees are losing focus as farther away they get. So I think that this is a good example of still a large amount of realism in an image. Now here we're making a little bit of a sudden shift. I don't know if you're familiar with William Morris, who is a prolific uh, textile designer in the 19th century, doing a lot of stuff, but a lot of things that he did were referenced directly from things like Persian miniature painting, for example. And this is a really good example of a stylized image that is directly related to Persian miniature painting. Now we can tell that this is a tree, and we can tell it is a tree with birds, fruit, and flowers. A lot of the times, though, those images come from the cartoon, or that information comes from the cartoon or stylized image, as opposed to any sort of a naturalistic rendering. We can see that this is a rather flat image. Everything is equally in focus, which also tends to lead it away from realism somewhat. The tree, the branches are very cleanly separated with very even lines, rather smooth delineation of form and shape. And then we look at the flowers, and it's very rare that you see a flower in nature where it's all laid out. Unless it's been set up very specific by a photographer, it's very rare that you're going to see, let's see how many flowers are on this, maybe 15 flowers. And we have them all in either perfect profiles or perfect head-on shots. And that's happens very, very rarely, if at all, in the real world. And these flowers all have the same, each species of flower has the same number of petals, and they're all shown from the same perspective, and they're all even. And we can kind of tell a time period of when this was painted as well, because of the way that the artist chose to depict different things. The those little things that almost look like claw marks or claws, we can guess are going to be grass, uh, to kind of help us to fill in the background by ourselves. We have the partridge on the branch in the lower left and upper right, lower right, as well as the two birds in the tree itself. And all these leaves, instead of having any leaves from a natural perspective, they're all the idealized full-on leaves. So even though there are a lot of naturalistic references to this, with the birds being looking relatively like normal birds, the leaves looking like relatively like normal leaves, and the flowers and the fruit as well, still this is starting towards that abstraction. And because everything is becoming very stylized, and it's stylized to the point where if you saw a bird like this in the real world, it would be kind of startling because it's not exactly what we expect a natural bird to look like. So we're moving a little bit more away from that realistic perspective. Now here's a really good one. I believe that this is the state flag for New Hampshire, and it also is a reference to one of the early United States flags. We look at this and how many can identify what that shape is in the white field in the upper left? Well, from the training that we've received, we expect that to be a tree. And we can see that there is a roughly triangular shaped canopy We're looking at a tree in silhouette, essentially. And even though there are irregularities to that triangular shape, what we assume are branches kind of fill out that form. That vertical line at the bottom of the triangular bunching, we assume to be a trunk. And then underneath it is that root mound that is showing up under the earth. And I'm sorry, as it presses against the earth from underneath. And we can see all that, take it in, and we accept that as a tree. But is it realistic? It's not very realistic at all. The artist that has done this has focused on those things that trigger us to identify an object as a tree and has related essentially just those triggers. So if you saw this in the real world, it would kind of freak you out. It is not a tree. But because of the stylized rendering and the simplification, what we have is an abstracted tree that communicates to us the idea of a tree. So it functions as a tree. Now here, this is a tree also. Does anybody recognize it? This is a kanji tree, or an ideoglyph is another term for it. We look at this, the strong vertical line. Well, I'm sorry, let me start again, just really briefly. Ideoglyphs are a way of writing where pictures are related with what have become the simplest lines to depict or reference the object behind what the picture represents. And in this, we can see over time that the kanji has been generated from 4 different strokes that represent primary beat points of the image that this is supposed to represent. This is the kanji for tree. So we have a vertical line that represents a trunk. We have 2 diagonal lines coming from the top of the trunk that represent the silhouette of that triangular tree canopy that we saw in the previous one. We can see the strong vertical line here and these 2 diagonals, one to the right and one to the left. If we go back to that previous image, we can see here's the strong vertical trunk line, and on the right we have that triangular shape from the tree, and on the left we have the triangular shape from the tree as well. And then we have this line at the bottom that shows where the tree goes into the ground. And I believe in the kanji, that horizontal line represents more of a horizon or ground line as well. But again, this is a tree. It's very stylized. But if we didn't know it was a tree, it becomes very difficult to identify it as a tree. And this becomes more of that abstracted form, or an abstracted version of a tree that we were talking about. So you can kind of see, if we go back, look at these trees, how they are gradually going from rather realistic, a little bit more stylized, quite a bit more stylized. Now it's symbolic and very stylized, to almost entirely abstracted. So what's the next step? Well, if we look at this, can anybody make out the tree in this? This is from an artist friend. Her name is Karen Green Recor. She does these abstracted color field type paintings on steel plate, and I think that they're quite beautiful. But I'm referencing this as a tree as well. Anybody have any idea why? I want you to think about it just for a second and see if you can find the tree in this. Now, if we look at this, Do we see much of a tree? Well, arguably, right off from the initial impact of this, probably not. But from the setup, from those things that we've been looking for, some of the things that we can see in this are we have a strong vertical passage. We have these diagonal lines that kind of suggest to mind the silhouette of a tree canopy. And we have these green areas that we have been conditioned to associate with grass and trees. And then we also have these vertical lines at the base of these green areas that are a different color, a different shape. And a lot of the times we have been trained to associate this kind of relationship, a triangle at top, loose triangle, with a narrow rectangle at the bottom, with a depiction of, or stylized depiction of the tree. These, to me, kind of remind me of poplars. So we have these, I don't know if you can see, in the center of the bottom of this image, we have these dark brown, dark gray oblongs, which represent something like, or could be analogous to something like a trunk. And then this beautiful green passage of this narrow triangle that goes up towards the top of the painting could very well be something reminiscent of a poplar. I asked Karen about this, and she liked that idea. And it may very well be that these were unintentionally designed to be trees of some sort. But I think that what is fascinating is that when she does her process, she will create abstractions that are loosely based on formats like typical still lifes and landscapes that artists have used, and she uses that as a jumping off point. And then she creates these very abstracted, very non-objective color fields that still, if we have that context of trees in the back of our mind, we can see the treeness in here. But it doesn't have to be. And you could set this on its side and it would still function just absolutely fine as a painting. And this is where we get into the idea of abstraction and non-objection, because whether or not she started using as a tree with a reference right now, this is just a painting with passages of color. But we are also dealing with that idea, like I said, of non-objection. Now let's see. I'm sorry, I forgot how to change this. Now, here's something. I know that you guys know who Pete Mondrian is. He pretty much defined a genre of textile design and way of looking at modern art that people still reference decades after he passed away. He lived in a time where the world was rapidly changing from this concept, this habit of where most people in the world would live and die within a day's journey of where they were born. And over the last 200 years, from the end of the 18th century to mid 20th century, we see this in just a few short generations. We see this genesis of travel and communication technologies that made it so that when people, when our great-grandparents would travel, it would take an incredibly long time to go somewhere. It would be very costly to communicate with somebody. And today, we can virtually travel almost anywhere in the solar system in a matter of moments. And we can communicate with people on the far side of the world, even people orbiting the planet, with the time lag of the speed of light. And that's it. It's incredible. And so Pete Mondrian was painting at a very impactful moment of history when people were becoming rapidly more aware of these increases in travel and communication technology. And one of the things he wanted to do was see how he could simplify the world so that maybe we didn't have to deal with so many variables as we were trying to access and understand the world, because otherwise the world could be very confusing. So these are meant as well, one reason for these paintings is that they are meant as meditations. Now, I would like to ask the question, can anybody identify what this is? Because it is of an identifiable subject. But if we look at this, what we see is a very non-objective painting. All we see are mathematically organized horizontal and vertical lines, white background, and a blue square. But what if I told you this fits in with everything that we've already been talking about? This is actually a landscape. Think about that for just a moment. If this is a landscape and it looks so non-objective, if it's actually a landscape, then it becomes abstract. How did Pete Mondrian get from a landscape to this? Well, if we look at these, are all paintings by Pete Mondrian, and I put them in a chronological order compared to as evidenced by the development of his style. So in the top left, we get this very colorful, very brilliant depiction of, can anybody guess what it is? Same thing that we've been dealing with. We have the vertical line for the trunk and the two diagonal lines that represent the canopy. This is a tree. And then we have the very strong horizontal line that represents either the ground or the horizon. So this is a tree, but it's done in a very impressionistic style, where the artist is celebrating the bouncing of light off the object, as opposed to celebrating the object itself as a static thing. And we can see that Pete Mondrian is just really enamored of the forms of the tree, the sweeping shapes of the branches, how the color interacts with the bark, and we can see the texture of the bark, how the color interacts with just the ground around the tree. We get to the center of the top, we can see where he's focusing a little bit more on trying to simplify the forms of the tree a little bit away from how the light bounces off the trunk. My suspicion is that this is the same tree, and I'm thinking that just because of the curves of the branches and how the canopy spreads out. And I look at the brush strokes, the horizontal brush strokes on the ground kind of remind me of the ground as well. And I think it's a slightly different view of the tree, but I believe that this is the same tree. And I love how he is kind of focusing on just the enjoyment of those sweeping branches, the gentle curves of the branches, and how they kind of fade into the sky around them. And we see that the artist, rather than making something that is a faithful depiction of the realistic tree, the artist is rather kind of expressing themselves as they show what they find most intriguing and exciting about the tree, which is those sweeping forms that are associated with the branches. And I love how the focus on those sweeping forms and the enjoyment of those sweeping forms, as opposed to trying to make us be painfully aware that these are literally branches. We go to the one right of that, the top right corner. Here, the artist, rather than trying to focus on merely the tree, Pete Mondrian is showing us some of these color shifts that happen as our eyes shift focus going from branch to branch. But he's also sharing with us these sweeping, curving forms that relate to the branches. And I think that this is a really good example of abstraction, because the artist, again, is focusing just on the enjoyment of the forms and variations of shading and color, as opposed to making it obvious that the artist is working on a tree. Now, the bottom left, this is where I think we can see a little bit of evidence of Pete Mondrian's relation to the world outside of himself, where he's talking about these technologies increasing in the fields of transportation and communication. We start feeling that this tree form has almost taken on the shape of the angular. If we look at a city from above, we see a lot of angular street patterns and the rigid structures of buildings. as seen from above. And I think that there's some reference to that in this. Maybe think he's trying to collate or coordinate a lot of the just random inputs that we get as life seems to speed up, as communication time decreases. And then center, of course, I'm probably reading a lot into that, but we can see that the tree form directly above it is still kind of sort of in there, but a lot of it is disappearing because the artist is focusing on the shapes. We look at that center at the bottom. We can still kind of feel some of the colors maybe of bark. We have some of the warm tones. Some of those rectangles and squares maybe have a little bit of green tones to them, like we associate with a tree. And there's some blue tones that might be associated with sky. But the artist is still focusing on the relationship of lines, and now he is parsing it down. Instead of making sweeping, curving lines, the artist is parsing it down and generating only horizontal and vertical lines, trying to figure out almost mathematical abstractions of where those branches might be. And then if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that the artist has strayed even further from a realistic depiction of a tree and has parsed it down into some of its most simple forms. And perhaps that lower left-hand square that's all black, maybe that's a reference to the trunk. And that horizontal line that's at the very top edge of the painting, maybe that's a reference to the top edge of the canopy of the tree. There's no diagonals here or anything, it's all straight edges, horizontal and vertical. Maybe the far right vertical line is a reference to the far right extreme of the canopy of the tree. Same with the far left. Maybe that far right upper orange square or amber is a reference to sunlight. And that large red area is a reference to the sunlight bouncing off of the bark of the tree. And we can kind of see echoes of that. If you look in the top left of that tree where Pete Mondrian painted all the red dots coming off as reflected light from the trunk, maybe there's a reference there. But what is fascinating to me is that if you looked at that by itself, there is no way that you would ever think that could be related to a tree. It doesn't feel like there's much treeness in there. But these are all from the same subject matter, all these 6 paintings, and chronologically they follow the development of his style from this very impressionistic depiction of something that we easily recognize as a tree to something that becomes what we identify today as very modern looking, with almost just mathematical coldness to it, where there's just horizontal and vertical lines. And I believe at one point he said about his own artwork that he was trying to find the simplest way of depicting complex ideas or complex imagery, parsing it down until he got to the point where he only used vertical and horizontal lines, and then white, black, and the primary colors, and sometimes green. I think that that's really a fascinating show of the evolution of this super abstraction, this almost non-objective depiction of what we now know is a tree. So I'm going to turn off the screen share. I hope that helps a little bit as you look at the different possibilities for working with abstraction. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit distracted because I'm trying to find where I put the icon for the screen. As we look at this next assignment, abstraction refers to working with an idea to the point where you're kind of simplifying it from the reality. And as an artist, when you're doing an abstraction piece, I want you to explore elements of that subject matter that you're working with that are just kind of that you feel that you respond to, that are fun to work with. So, for example, spirals are. If you look at people working with clay for the first time, they like to squish it in their fingers, and they like to twist the clay, and spirals become something that are very fascinating to work with. I think that organic forms that we see in the ocean are beautiful, uh, and a lot of the times they have a lot of relationship to what we do when we, for example, play with clay for the first time. Now, everybody in their kit does have a little bag of clay. What I would like you to do before you start carving, make three-dimensional sketches, and it would be really great to see if you wouldn't mind photographing some of these things that you make. But you can reuse this clay. I think it will dry out, so maybe just pull a third of it and do a little sculpture like that really quickly, and take photographs of those. But what I want you to do is start with an idea of a form, make a three-dimensional thing out of that idea of a form, and kind of explore the different contours and shapes, and let your fingers have fun as you're playing with the clay. And I would really appreciate it if you would take a couple photos, and you don't necessarily have to show them to me, but I want you to keep those little sculptures that you make as references as you go to your carving. You know, one thing I should say is that previous students have done things that are uh, relatively blocky, or maybe three-dimensional depictions of cartoon characters. And although cartoon characters are abstractions, they're very rarely that there's a one-to-one correspondence with reality. When look at Rick and Morty, for example, the reason you accept those characters as human being analogs is simply because they have a lot of the identifiers that seem to collate with um, symbols of human beings. If you saw a real person that was in the shape of Rick or Morty, I think most of us would run screaming for the hills, because they are not actually realistic. But I don't want you to do cartoon characters, and I don't want you to make a block. I want you to play with the clay, see how you feel about different forms, and find forms that you enjoy in a three-dimensional shape, or in the three-dimensional clay, and then you'll work on transferring those forms that you enjoy into the clay. You're not making into the foam that you're carving. Excuse me. You're not making something that can be identified. You are exploring a process of finding physical passages of form that you enjoy working with. One way to do this process would be take a leaf, look at the leaf, examine the outside form. So let's say the leaf is a spade form, where it's kind of bellied out on one end. It comes to a point. The belly end is uh, where the stem attaches. So we have this almost triangular, diamondy kind of thing that has a very organic line to it. When you look at the leaf really closely, you'll see that there are pretty much bumps between the areas where the veining is. And those bumps kind of pillow out from the flat surface of the leaf. Maybe the edge has a little bit of striation to it. Maybe it's a little jagged, maybe it's smooth. Maybe there are forms where you like how the stem emerges from the perimeter of the leaf shape. Maybe you like how light changes as it passes through the leaf. You take your clay and start playing with maybe a stem structure, maybe working on some of those areas where it pillows out the leaf pillowed out between the veins. And maybe you just like how the structure of the leaf changes from the base of the stem to the veining in the leaf. And that passage is particularly interesting to you. Take the clay and just kind of play with that idea a little bit. Fiddle with it with your hands. Get to a form where it feels somewhat satisfying to you. Try to listen, if you can, to what the clay is telling you as you're working with it. After you do that for a little bit, maybe gotten more comfortable with this kind of form. It's not going to represent anything you see in real life. And it may even look like, on the other hand, it may look like a seashell. And that's perfectly fine. Maybe there's elements like the scalloping on the edge of a seashell where it flutes out that you really like and want to work with. And that is perfectly fine. Then as you go to your foam, and this is the worst part of the whole project. This is, and I say worst because this is absolutely the messiest. I would recommend having a vacuum cleaner nearby, and I would recommend very strongly having a tarp or a sheet or something under you as you work on this. Static really attracts these little beads of foam, so I would wear clothes that don't have a lot of little folds in them, like even like smock or baggy pants or something like that, and then have a vacuum near you so that as you're done carving, you can vacuum yourself off. But you have a knife, you have several uh, files, or I'm sorry, you have a knife, you have a file. Use those to start shaping the foam to kind of mimic what you created in the clay. And we're looking for a form that is as big as you can get out of that chunk of foam that you have. And most of the foam chunks were at least the size of a volleyball. So I want you to play with that, and be very careful because even though it is a soft material, it wants to break, and it will break wherever you don't want it to. But as you're working with it, try to get a feel for what the foam wants to do as well. We're not looking for a flat object. We're looking for something that will look good from every side and will be at least interesting from every side. As you carve the foam, you can reference some of those videos on wood carving, but foam carving is something that is completely different. You're just going to be carving a little bit at a time until you get comfortable with it. And then as you work with it, you can reference those videos just for different shapes and forms that you can work with. I particularly enjoy for this, look at Henry Moore sculptures. Look at the sculptures in your artist research list for this module. I think there's 5 or 6. Um, Jean Van Arp, um, and there's I think, I don't know if Jan Moreau is one of those artists, but these artists did some very interesting things with organic forms. They almost look like they're working with things like kidneys and livers, which sounds kind of gross, but when they're taken out of the context of bodies, they become really interesting forms by themselves. The ends of bones, where bones join together. Uh, but these kinds of passages are very interesting. So work with that, carve on your form and try to listen to what the foam is telling you as you're working on that. When you get to a point where you're comfortable with that, when you're happy with that, vacuum up, clean up as much as you can, and then you'll get out the Tupperware container that has the powder in it and the glue. And this is a recipe. This is what you need for paper mache. You can mix that together. You can look up paper mache um, recipes online, but the recipe that we have is basically going to be: you take those bags out, put at least half or about half of the flour in there, about half of the glue, and then a similar volume in water of the glue that you put in. So if you pour in about a half cup of glue, I would put in a half cup of water, and I would mix that up. I should say though, before doing that, get your material that you're going to be using to soak in that uh, glue mixture to wrap your uh, object with. You're going to want to put some newspaper down, several layers of it, so that you don't get everything messy and irritate your family and your roommates. And you can use paper towels for one thing. Newsprint is another thing. You just tear them into inch-wide strips. One thing that works really well as well is a cotton fabric, like really inexpensive sheets that you might find at uh, Deseret Industries or another thrift store like Goodwill. I wouldn't use t-shirt material because that flexes quite a bit, stretches out, but sheets work really well. And I would tear You could start the tear with scissors, but I would tear them into about 3/4 inch wide to 1 inch wide strips, and make them anywhere from 6 to 10 inches long, maybe even a little bit longer if you wanted to. When you have several of these, what you'll do is mix about half of your mixture, uh, put in the same volume of water as the volume of glue that you're putting into the flour, mix it all up, uh, try to get all the lumps out that you can. If it feels really thick, it should be about little bit thicker than, I don't know if you've ever mixed chocolate milk yourself, but it should be a little bit thicker than that, and you may need to put in a little bit more water, and that's fine. Not quite milkshake texture, that's a little bit too thick. And then you're going to put the strips of paper or uh, cloth, and I think that newsprint and cloth are going to probably be the best ones, and cloth gives a very distinctly different texture to it than newsprint does. But you're going to put these in the glue mixture, squish them out around just a little bit, and then as you pull them out of the glue mixture, you'll kind of use two of your fingers to squeegee the extra off. And then you're going to take that and you'll start wrapping your foam sculpture with that. And you can use that to bunch it up in different areas if it's wet, smooth it out in others. You can even kind of paint a little bit with your fingers using the glue mixture and try to get that foam covered with the paper mache. And this is going to do a couple things. One is it's going to give it a completely different texture than the actual foam, but it's also going to start developing the form a little bit more concretely that you started working with the clay and then carving into the foam. Do that. Focus on ideas like texture. If you need to make more of the paper mache mixture, you can use the other, use the other half that you separated out. If you need even more, it's essentially wood glue and flour and butter, and that's pretty much all it is. And you just mix it until there's no lumps, and then you use that to kind of adhere your strips. If you squeegee too much of that mixture off of the cloth and the paper, it's not going to stick too well to the foam. By itself, it won't stick too well. I think one of the best ways to do this is to put a little bit more than you think you need to onto a lot of those fabric or newsprint strips. Wrap your object so that the fabric touches itself and kind of allow that to set up a little bit. And you can put the lid on the Tupperware container to kind of keep the paper mache mixture from drying out too much. You do that a couple times so you have the fabric adhering, or the newsprint adhering to itself around the form of the foam. That will give you a little bit more solid of a base to finish wrapping. Some people have also used the mixture, kind of smushed it on with their fingers a bit, and then used that to help mold the fabric or the newsprint after it's onto the shape of the foam. Work with that, allow it to dry, add to it however much you feel you need to until the form feels good to you. And I would like to, Thursday meeting, we'll have everybody that we can meet together so we can actually talk about this and see how people are doing. And I think interaction will be really good because then I can hear your questions. Sometimes I've noticed that people will have to use things like string to help get that fabric and newsprint more into the crevices and cutouts of the foam so that it will adhere to that shape a little bit better. And that is perfectly fine because after it dries you can cut the string and remove it. After you're done with that, you may want to smear some more of the paper mache texture on it. You may want to add more newsprint or cloth, or if you use newsprint in the original one, the second layer may be cloth, or the other way around. And then get it to a point where it's looking form-wise pretty close to what you feel the foam and the materials want you to do. After then, allow that to dry. After it dries completely, that's when we're going to start painting it. And this is where you can be a little bit more creative. The painting you can do with with regular acrylics. You can do that. You can spray paint it. Some things that I would suggest you consider. Acrylics are always really good, like I said. I would not use super expensive paints. I would use ones that are going to be more fun for you to play with, so you don't have the stress of potential screwing up if they're expensive paints. Some of the things that you can do is maybe paint it with lighter colors like a cream, and then go over it with a shoe polish, and maybe work at some of the exposed edges or leading edges. Some of the crinkles of the fabric and stuff might look very interesting doing that. Another thing that you can do is maybe work with lighter colors and overall, and then go back in after that dries and smush darker colors into some of the texture, make the texture really come out. If you use something like jeans for your strips of fabric in some areas, that makes a very interesting texture to paint against, as well as if you have sheets in other parts or newsprint in some parts. All those things together might be very interesting. Excuse me, I would like you to consider this too. Remember at the very beginning of the class I said this class is not for you to generate masterpieces for your portfolio. This class is for you to explore different ways of doing things. And I would very much like you to explore that as you're working with painting. Some of the more interesting things I've seen is where people have taken several different colors that are not shades of each other, like for example blue, purple, and yellow, and then they will, as they're painting their object, they will start shading from one color to another just to see how that goes. And that's really interesting because you kind of see that kind of color structure on fish scales, for example. Another thing that you can do color-wise is, for example, maybe color the whole thing a strong color, like a dark brown, for example. And then after that dries, do another layer over it, like say a green, a pale green, and spray paint that so that it's solid over the whole thing. And then after that dries completely, maybe do some very strong coats of a cream color. And then after you're all done with that, you have this cream colored thing. Take some of your sandpaper, maybe some of the rough sandpaper, go back through and start scratching away with the sandpaper passages of the paint that you did. So that in some areas you see the dark brown, and in other areas the cream is left, and in many passages you see that transition from the cream to the green to the brown. That might be a very interesting thing to explore as well. By the time you're all done with this, you'll have something that does not represent a cartoon character, it doesn't represent a chess piece, it doesn't represent anything from the real world, but the real world textures and forms informed your making of this. Maybe it looks like a really odd spiral barnacle shell structure, or maybe it looks like a leaf that bloated in the sunshine, or maybe it looks like bones from some sort of distorted alien. And that's completely fine. I want you to explore those different kinds of shapes and see how they come together in this three-dimensional form. After you've done your paper mache and the painting on it, you'll have something that looks very interesting, and maybe you want to paint it some more, maybe you won't. But when it gets to a point where you're relatively happy with it, and I should say that during all this process, if you want to add more paper mache to it, if you want to sandblast things or sand things away from it, if you want to do other things to it, that's fine too. But when you get to a point where you're happy with it, then I would like you to take, if you can get access to it, just some clear shellac and seal the whole thing with just spray clear coat, like a Krylon clear coat would be really good. Just spray the whole thing down, and then you can photograph it. And I would like you to photograph it from a couple different angles and save the angles that are the best for you. Now again, we will talk about this more on Thursday, and I will also go through and see if I can find some better videos to put into our module on this, and maybe even replace some of the wood cutting ones. I found some really good ones for cutting fruit, and that's really kind of interesting. and that can transfer over to cutting foam a little bit. But I want you to use those videos as they stand now as stepping off points. Again, the directions that I'm giving you for this project, the ones that you should listen to are the ones in this video, and use the directions that are currently in the module as a stepping off point to kind of guide you or inform you of how to initially address the foam. So the process of this is look at the artists in the research portion of this module number 3. Look at the forms that they're working with and what they do. Take the clay, play with the clay, fiddle with the clay, divide it up into different areas and make little teeny maquettes where you're just exploring the passage of form. Maybe all you're exploring is how your fingers crease translates into a three-dimensional form in the clay. And maybe that's what you're going to carve. So use those clay forms to inform the design of your foam sculpture. Cut that using the box cutter that you have in the kit as well as the file. Again, this makes a lot of mess, so you want to have a vacuum cleaner nearby. After you get that form pretty well made, mix the paper mache material as I discussed earlier. Save half, maybe only mix half of that, but use the cloth or newspaper strips that you tore. Soak that in the paper mache and wrap your foam object with that. When that dries, add to it, take away from it, whatever you need to, and then paint it. After you're done painting it, you can sand through the painting, you can do different things with the painting, and then at the very end you're going to use Krylon clear to seal the whole thing, if you have access to that. If you have any questions about this, I would appreciate it if you would email me, but definitely let's plan on meeting on Thursday morning, and we'll go through, bring your questions with you, and we'll go through and we'll answer them as much as possible. Remember, try not to get freaked out or upset by the time constraints on this. What I want you to do is explore this project with the biomorphic abstraction. And if it needs to take a little bit longer than the due date, that's fine. And remember that ultimately everything is due on the last day of finals. And the due dates are there just to help you move along. So later on today, I'm going to be finishing up the grading for the things that have been turned in over the weekend. And I am strongly encourage you to look at the meetings that we've had so far, record the code words that I put in, and of course, I just realized I did not include 3 code words yet for this. So the 3 code words for today's class are sheet, pink, the color pink, and blue. Not the color blue, but the emotion blue. As you work on these modules, hopefully you will have more questions. I'm also looking for questions on Thursday about the annotated bibliography. I will release the next portion of that project as well, coming out. And I'm hoping as you're working on the annotated bibliography, you keep in the back of your mind, what are the identifiers that makes this artist different from you? And what about their work really resonates with you? I don't think that you need to address those 2 questions in every single one of your annotations, but I would like you to be mindful of them and allow those 2 questions to inform the points of each of the citations that you make. Allow them to inform how you relate and write those annotations. What elements of those annotations, the articles and videos you focus on. What about that person's artwork is so intriguing to you? And what makes you resonate with somebody who is so different from yourself? So think about all that, and I really look forward to seeing what you folks come up with. Now, I did promise that these meetings would be an hour and a half long. Not a single person has joined this meeting live, which is sad and lonely for me, but I'm a big boy. I will deal with it. So since there is no questions, I will be ending it just a little bit early. I do appreciate your time. Remember those three code words. And if you do have any questions, please email me and make sure that you come onto the Thursday morning meeting. All right? And I will look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you enjoyed Pete Mondrian and an exploration from his original tree painting all the way to the very abstracted, almost non-objective looking horizontal vertical lines on a white canvas. I think that's an interesting thing to consider as you're pondering what does abstraction mean. I look forward to seeing everybody Thursday, and I hope you have a wonderful beginning to your week.